Welcome to the BA Knowledge Share. And in this episode, it's a special episode. We're talking about the visualization and business analysis. And I have with me today Grant Wright. So welcome, Grant, to this podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So Grant, can you sort of introduce yourself and let the audience know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working in the field of business analysis. I've actually lost count of how many years, over 20 years. And yes, I did start very young before you ask. And yeah, I think I've always, when I've worked as a BA, I've always enjoyed being around a whiteboard and externalizing my thoughts to kind of help make sense of things and kind of bring other people into the conversation. And in recent years, I've kind of discovered there's a whole world of visual thinking out there with techniques you can use to amplify business analysis even further. And so for the last few years, I've really focused on how I can use that to enhance my kind of BA consultancy work, but also you'll see from my background with the Visual Jam, we with a colleague of mine, a guy called Paddy Dander, we in August 2020 we launched the Visual Jam as a virtual community where people could come along every month and learn about visual thinking from different thought leaders in the community. And now we've got a community of, I think it's well over 2,000 people worldwide, and yes, it's going from strength to strength. So yeah, that's kind of a bit about me and my background, and I guess how visual thinking plays into that.
Yeah, and what got me excited about this episode is I am a big fan of anything visual, anything art. So for me, combining really business analysis to visual thinking, it's a fascinating topic for me. So just to transition into visual thinking. So what is visual thinking?
So I've prepared some information because I thought you might ask me these kind of questions. So I've got a few things that I thought might be useful to share. So if I just sort of share my screen at the relevant points as we're talking, and then what I can do is I can kind of bring to life what I mean. So you can see my hand there, right?
Yes, I can see the whiteboard and your hand. Yeah.
Excellent. So I think if we start with that kind of broad question, what is visual thinking? I've got a little visual prop here to help that discussion. So from my perspective, visual thinking is really about being able to take different inputs that are often verbal, people talking to you, looking at written information, but they can be different forms. And it's kind of being able to then translate that to see things in your mind's eye and make sense of it. And in doing that, you were able to literally show people what your view of the world is so that they can help kind of go on the journey with you. There's a side kind of benefit to that, is that visual thinking can then make things more memorable for the people you're working with. They take in the information easier, and ultimately that brings us kind of more clarity when we're working. So at a real high level, that's kind of my take on what visual thinking is. But it's quite a broad church, but at that level, that's kind of how I try and explain it.
Yeah, so it's interesting in this visual, you have everything there. So I think the idea of really storing that information in your mind's eye and sort of taking that information through your mind and really depicting it in a form that people can consume. This is a good depiction of that.
Yeah.
Just to sort of transition into how can you sort of merge work with visual thinking, or how can BAs use this in their day-to-day job?
So I guess there's lots of ways that BAs can apply visual thinking, and I think it's probably easiest to first of all talk in more general terms about how visual thinking can help anyone in their work, and from that I think it becomes more obvious how it applies to business analysis. So if for example we look at the benefits of visual thinking. I recently produced this visual, was doing some work with a guy called Todd Churches, who's the author of Visual Leadership. And Todd was one of our past guests on the Visual Jam. And he was one of the first people that I kind of discovered when I went on my kind of exploration into the world of visual thinking. And I really loved the way that he simply explained the benefits of visual thinking. What does it do for us? And he summarized it into attention, comprehension, and retention. So attention is literally that. It's using the visuals to grab your attention to help you see what people are trying to say. Comprehension is obviously about the benefit of improving understanding. So how many times have you sat in a meeting where people are talking around a problem and then somebody sketches something on a whiteboard or produces a visual, and then you've got an anchor for the conversation. People can say, all right, I get it, there's something tangible there to hook the conversation into. And retention is that kind of benefit of being able to remember what was discussed. You know, there's proven science and statistics around how the use of visuals in combination with words is the sweet spot. It's called dual coding theory. And that really improves our ability to retain information and remember things. So I can attest to that when I use visual thinking to help me with learning in the form of sketch notes, for example. I take in and remember that information far more vividly than if I'd just taken traditional notes. If I'd taken ordinary notes and I tried to remember in a year's time what the talk was about, I would probably struggle. If I've taken the time to produce a sketch note, and I can show you some examples later on maybe, that completely changes the way I take in that information and the way that I remember that information. And I guess just to take that step further, there's a company, apologies, just grabbed a book. There's a company called Bureau Brand who wrote this book called Visual Thinking. It's by a lady called Wilhelmine Brand. And they've produced this summary of visual thinking and 5 visual thinking types, which I think is really valuable because, as I kind of said at the start, visual thinking is quite a broad topic. And so not every aspect of visual thinking will resonate with everybody to the same extent, I guess. So they talk about you can be a visual analyst where you're using visuals to make sense of things. I do that a lot in my kind of consultancy work. If I can't draw something, I don't feel that I truly understand it. So that's the kind of aspect there where it's making sense of things. The visual co-creator kind of builds on that with the idea of using visuals in a group context to leverage the wisdom of crowds and to get their perspective. They can see things that you've missed maybe in your visual or your explanation, but also you can use kind of visual templates to help with kind of creative ideation sessions where you're brainstorming, those kind of things. Visual templates are a good structure, or canvases, those kind of things. And then the other ones are maybe not as obviously relevant to BAs, but they do still apply. The visual reporter is that kind of sketch noting and summarizing information that you've taken in verbally in a visual way to help you remember and understand things. The visual storyteller is kind of how you use visuals to accompany explanations of things, which does apply to BAs. And the visual designer is more on that kind of graphic design end of the scale, where it's using hand-drawn visuals in a more unique way to create more compelling communication, which again has a place, but maybe less relevant to BAs. But does that give you a better sense of kind of what visual thinking brings to the table generally?
Yeah, and you brought up brainstorming, right? As this is just one technique that VAs use to really hone in on solutions or options. Speaking of the business analysis and visual thinking, let me take it a step further. How can visual thinking be applied in business analysis to improve, say, data interpretation and decision making? So do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think in the context of you're saying data, whatever, potato.
Data.
Data visualization, as I say, I think that is a topic in its own right, to be fair, but visual thinking has a part to play in that. Again, I can maybe illustrate what I mean. So if I was to try and speak to you about some data, let me share my view again. And let's imagine that we're having a conversation and we're talking about some survey results. And I present to you maybe a graph, and that graph has some, some bars on there, something like this. And if I was to show you this information, but I just give it a generic title and I don't give it any context and I don't give it any emphasis, you've got to do the hard work in trying to work out, what's this telling me? You've got to kind of draw the conclusion, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Let's imagine that this axis is the percentage of complaints that we're getting about a particular digital product. Mm-hmm. All right, so now I can see that I've got different things causing a different level of complaints. But again, what am I trying to emphasize? I can use visual language to emphasize that this is the point I want to make. So I can leave everything else a different color or a secondary color. So it's there, it's context setting, but it's not the main point. So just by doing that, you can see the important point I'm trying to make. You know it's the yellow block, right?
Yep.
And if I was to kind of almost label this and say, what's this graph telling me, rather than percentage of complaints by category of complaint or something generic like that, if I gave it a title that said, something like half of our complaints are due to user experience or bad user experience, whatever, something that emphasizes what's the conclusion that the reader should draw from that. And if you were presenting this in a slide, you could take it a bit further. You could say, well, if we're talking about a mobile app, I could do a little visual. I could draw a little mobile device, and I could draw maybe somebody holding on to this device, and maybe this person is kind of looking at their phone. I just draw a little character just to emphasize this. So maybe they're looking at their phone, and just with a little expression, they're looking a bit confused. And to really hammer home the point, I'm going to make them scratch their head. Mm-hmm. So they're looking at their phone, they're confused, they're not sure what's going on. I can really hammer home the point with a couple of visual indicators, something like that. And if I really want to kind of make the point, this is our app, that's causing this confusion. If I now flash that in a slide when I'm presenting some context of research findings, how much quicker can you get the message of what I'm trying to say in this visual? I've highlighted the key issue here. You know that it's confusion due to user experience, and I've echoed it with a visual that tells you that. So that's just a really simple example of how visuals can be used to kind of amplify what you're trying to say and make things easier to consume. I think another example, and I know I showed you this just before, but I think it's such a good little example that I wanted to show it on this call. So here's a website that is all about showing us the amount of plastic single-use bottles that we're using and the kind of the impact of that. And this shows you that since we've opened the app, this is how many plastic bottles have been sold around the world. And you can see already it's covering the person, it's covering the bus. If I move down, every hour, every day, every month, the scale of the problem in a year, we dwarf the tallest building in the world in terms of the height of that little tower. And then over the last 10 years, enough plastic bottles to dwarf New York City skyscrapers. It gives you a sense of scale. And again, that's using visuals and metaphors to kind of hammer home the scale of what you're saying, to make it easier for people to comprehend. So visuals can also kind of help in that space to kind of bridge that gap when somebody says something, you're like, well, what does that even mean? You can sort of
Yeah.
literally represent it.
Yeah, so I'm thinking big data. I'm thinking with so much data out there, and really the human mind can only take and absorb so much information and has only so much of an attention span.
Yeah.
Really using the power of graphics, not necessarily but the visual part of it. I'm sure and you might have seen it in your work. It's probably a lot more effective than trying to communicate something verbally, therefore saving a lot of time, money, for any sort of business.
No, 100%. I think, and it's just about, the things you're talking about, that they're really technical, complex subjects, but being able to kind of really simplify the implications of what you're saying through a combination of visuals and storytelling. I think that's the sweet spot. It's just finding ways to connect better with the recipient of the information and take away the friction for the explanation.
Right. So you showed us a different, like your way of creating a graphic. Are there any tools out there or some sort of visual thinking techniques that you would recommend for business analysts or in business analysis in general?
I mean, there's lots of flavors. Again, if I just flash up my my camera, I've got a few resources here. If I just grab them, there's a few books. You can still hear me. That I already mentioned the visual thinking book there. There's the first book that I really got drawn into visual thinking, and wasn't actually a visual thinking book. It was a book about impact mapping by Gojko Adzic. I don't know if you've come across that. But what connected me to this was the visuals that resonated with me and explained how this technique worked. And so this kind of really made a difference to my ability to consume that information. And that kind of piqued my interest. So that was kind of what got me going. But this was the first book proper that I bought on visual thinking specifically. Mike wrote his Sketchnote Handbook, where he talks through a whole bunch of techniques for how to learn how to do visual thinking. There's different explanations of things and how you go about doing it and how you practice, and different techniques and ways to do things and structure and layout. So definitely recommend Mike's book. There's Sonny Brown's Doodle Revolution. It's another great book. I'm not sure how widely available this one is, but Martin Hausman's Usmo, Thinking with Your Pen, is a really detailed, comprehensive guide. So there's lots of, and there's lots more I can drag off the shelf behind me, but there's lots and lots of authors talking about this, different people offering their advice. And I found that I learned just by following people on Instagram in particular. A lot of people share, if you follow hashtag sketchnoting or visual thinking on Instagram, people post little videos, how-to things to get you going, get you started. So that's kind of how I got going. And then sort of started reading the books and looking for other learning opportunities. And obviously the Visual Jam that I've already mentioned, we run those free monthly events where people can come and listen to those experts. Many of those authors we've had on the Visual Jam as guests, and they've given up their time for free to share with us.
Maybe we can share a link to those sessions.
Yeah,
that would be incredible to share with the audience. How can visual thinking be used to enhance collaboration between, say, business analysts, stakeholders, other team members? How can it be used as a collaboration tool?
well, I think we've kind of already touched upon how that kind of visual co-creator idea that I talked about. So using visuals, whether that's face-to-face on a whiteboard or like I've been doing on a document camera remotely, you can use visuals to kind of externalize your thoughts. And like I said, people can sort of start to understand what you're trying to say. They can identify gaps in your thinking. It invites conversation, and the fact that they are kind of hand-drawn scribbles, everybody kind of knows they're not finished. It's kind of like, it's like user experience design. People who are building an app will typically wireframe that app first, because that invites feedback, it invites conversation. So visual thinking can play a role to invite conversation when you're exploring problems and trying to make sense of things. But also, I mentioned those visual templates. So if you've ever worked on an agile team and you've maybe run a retrospective, you use different templates to elicit feedback and to kind of get the conversation going on the right track. So you can use visuals in that way as well to kind of enhance collaboration, to use the visuals really in that context more as like scaffolding to get the conversation going and to get people thinking. And when you do externalize your thoughts, it doesn't all have to be hand drawn. It can be post-it notes and whatever. It's more about getting your ideas out in that context, I think.
And I can imagine let me go a little bit off the question track here. How quickly can a BA get up to speed if they wanted to start using these techniques? Is there a learning curve?
So I think that comes back to the context with which you want to use them. So when I first started using visuals, I did little doodles in my to-do list. I do a mind map of stuff that I had to get done or stuff I had to explore as part of a project. And I'd use little icons to remind me of stuff and use little visual anchors. But it wasn't for anybody else's benefit. It was just for me, for my understanding. And then I started using visuals in sketch notes to help me learn about different things when I went to conferences or listened to webinars. So even just to get started, you can do that for your own benefit, and it doesn't matter how bad your drawing is. It's not about drawing for the sake of art. It's about using visuals to do things or to understand things. And so I think you've got to get comfortable with your visuals not being perfect, and you can practice. You can build your visual vocabulary, we call it, so you can learn how to do things. So when I was just drawing stuff for you there, I've drawn a person, little stick figure in that sort of format, and a little mobile phone 1,000 times now. So I can do that live and on the fly because I've practiced it. So it's like anything, the more you practice, the more you get comfortable. You can transition from taking notes for your own benefit to maybe having the confidence to step in front of a flip chart and say, is this what you mean? And then as you get more confident, you can actually polish those visuals a bit more and put them into your slides and do more and more with it. So I think, there is a learning curve depending on how you want to apply the visuals and in what context. But there's not much of a barrier to getting started. It's not about fine art. It's about ideas and getting that understanding.
Yeah, and I'm sure this gets into so in terms of not so much best practices, there probably some things that you can start off with, like basics that from the books that you showed us so far and recommended, and sort of slowly incrementally getting better and better and incorporating or leaning in those visuals into your meetings, so that you can sort of make it natural, right? So it's like drinking water. It comes naturally. What role does visual storytelling play in communicating business analysis findings and insights? And you've touched upon this briefly in different parts of this conversation as well. But
So I mean, I think that example when we talked about data visualization was effectively, if I just pull that up again, this is an element of visual storytelling in itself for a single message. The plastic bottle video was another example of storytelling to make a point. So I think visuals absolutely play a part. What I would say is that when you're talking about visuals in this context, I've got a little slide that we used in one of our talks about visual storytelling, and I think the point is that when you're communicating and you're using storytelling, actually the most important thing isn't the visuals. It's being clear on the message and what you're trying to say to your audience is the most important thing first and foremost. But what visuals can do is they can really amplify and complement what you're saying. So if I just talk to you about something, I can get my point across. But if I have a visual that backs that up, maybe a little metaphor or play on words that emphasizes that, it can strengthen what you're trying to say and make it connect and imprint better on people's brains. So in this example, we were making the point that you could have the best idea ever. So you could have a really clear message. But if you don't know how to put that across in a way that makes people care about what you're saying, then your idea, like this poor little light bulb, will never take flight. It's trapped. But you need to unlock it by learning how to get clear on your core message, in your explanations, and then being able to produce visuals that can bring your explanations to life. So this in itself is visual storytelling to make that point that I've just made. Does that make sense?
This is very powerful. And when you talk about storytelling, I keep going back to big data, and I keep going back to the enormity of information out there. Is there's just so much information. So how do you get your point across given so much information and whittle it down so that the audience really, it makes an impact on the audience? Absolutely. So this is really insightful. If people wanted to reach you or learn more about this, where would they go?
I'm quite active on LinkedIn, so you could find me on there. You can head to thevisualjam.com and see what we do there. We've got a community that you can join as well. And I'm also on Instagram, GW_Wright, not a very creative Instagram handle, but I'm on there, and a few of my visuals are on there. So any of those platforms you can find me on. I'll be more than happy to talk to people about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Grant. And then in this episode, we learned about how to use visuals for business analysts. There's a lot more stuff here for those that are on the podcast and weren't able to see the visuals. This is available on YouTube as well. So you feel free to go there, and I will provide those links at the bottom in the show notes. So thank you so much for your time, Grant. I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you.